People ask me about a book of some kind that they can read that will make their lives better, to help them understand themselves and help them do the things they want to do. And I'm going to tell you about such a book today. The book is called A Course in Miracles. Now, its beginning was probably one of the strangest beginnings that a book could ever have. There were these two psychologists that were working at this university teaching, and they couldn't get along. They were absolutely at odds with one another on everything. And one day, one of them was a man and the other a woman. And the woman came into the office of the man, and they got into one of their usual arguments, and they argued and they yelled and they screamed. And when she left that room, she walked outside of it. She was walking down the hall, and she said out loud to herself, "There must be a better way." And within her mind, there was a voice that said, "Prepare to take dictation." Well, she had never heard a voice before, and she thought that was a little weird, but she just passed it off and went on about her daily business. But as the day went by, she heard that voice again. Prepare to take dictation. And so she kept ignoring it, and it went on the next day and the next day after that, and the voice was still there, and she's beginning to get worried. She thought maybe she was becoming insane or something, mentally ill. So she went back to this professor that she had all the big arguments with, and she told him about it. She said, "I keep hearing this voice that says, prepare to take dictation." And the professor reached in his box, and he pulled out a sheet of paper and a pencil and handed it to her and said, "Go, take dictation." So she started to take dictation. This was the beginning of the Course in Miracles. This dictation lasted for years, and the two collaborated and worked together in evenings and weekends and what have you. I can't remember how many years it took. I think somewhere between 7 and 11 years. This is a big book. And she was worried at times about it, and she kept writing it down, and sometimes it didn't seem to make any sense to her at all. But then a pattern began to emerge, and she began to realize that this book was something special. So when they got it finished, then they didn't know what to do with it. So they made a copy of it. I don't know how many pages they had of it. It was a big lot of them, because I think the book has almost 1,000 pages in it. So the typewritten sheets, you can imagine how much they were. So they made a copy of them, and they sent this to a friend of theirs in another state. They wanted him to read it to see if it wasn't totally crazy. And they didn't hear from him, and they didn't hear from him, and they didn't hear from him. And after months went by, they called him up and said, "What happened?" And he said, "I loved that book." He said, "I made about 50 copies of it, and I've sent it to other people." And said, "They're making copies of it." And said, "There's probably 100 copies of that book now out." And she said, Well, I don't know how to get it published because we don't have that kind of money. It's a big book and it's going to be very expensive to publish. And so they were wondering how to get it published when there was an oil man down in Texas happened to come across a copy of it, and he read it, and he wanted to know who the source of it was. So working back to them, he found the source, and he told him, he said, you take this book to this printer of mine in Chicago and you tell him to publish it, and I'll pay for it, whatever it costs. So they published, I don't remember, I think maybe 1,000 on the first run, and they were sold within 2 or 3 weeks. Well, one thing led to another, and now this book is all over the world. You can find it in almost every country in the world, and it's mostly taught in study groups. There are some churches who have a course that teaches this Course in Miracles, and mostly it's in small study groups everywhere. And so this lady, when it was all over, she asked, she said, asked the voice in her head, said, why me? And the voice said, because I knew you'd do it. And she was convinced when people asked her who was the person that dictated this book to her, she said she was convinced it was Jesus. The book doesn't contain any contradictions, and it doesn't contain anything that doesn't need to be there. It comes in 3 parts. There's the main text, there's a teacher's workbook, or a lesson plan maybe, and then there is a daily workbook. And I always recommend that people read that teacher's manual first, and then they start on the daily workbook. Now, the daily workbook goes for 365 days, and it gives you something to do each day. You're getting to be a little more each day. But they're real good, like affirmations and things like that as you've been going along. Now, the text itself is a little difficult to read, and most of the books have some help with that as you read that book. It reads a lot like the Bible, to tell you the truth. But there's no, like I said, there's no contradictions in it. And in many places in there, you'll see it say that I once said this, but now I'm saying this to you, and it will explain something else to you. Now, this book is a life changer. If you do the daily workbook and you read that book, you will have a better life. You will understand more about life than you've ever understood before, and it will help you tremendously. And the name of the book is A Course in Miracles, and you can buy it everywhere. So, thank you for listening to me.